Hi, everybody. I want to talk about diversity in this lecture. There's all kinds of different layers of diversity out there. Like this chart kind of captures all the, not all, but quite a few different elements of diversity. This model presents three layers, uh, starting with our external dimensions, income, marital status, appearance, then internal, physical ability, sexual orientation, gender, age, race, and then personality in the middle. Now, a lot of these we can really divide up into very small slices of pie. For example, geographic location, we can break this down to, hemisphere. We can break it down to country, region. In the United States alone, we could break it down to, a million different ways from do you live in Yakult or the Pearl District or whatever, right? So each of these is some kind of layer of diversity that has some kind of influence on who we are. So we can break it down into, these are some of the common dimensions of diversity that we think of. The two I want to focus on tonight, the ones that we see most often in a group, is diverse personalities and diverse perspective. Obviously, we want to welcome all of these forms of diversity. If you go to the work of Brian Uzi definitely says, the more diversity we have, the broader ranges of ideas and inputs we're going to have to choose from, and more importantly, that we could grab different elements of these ideas and combine them in new ways to create something new. Okay, so tonight we're really going to talk about this personality and how it leads to diversity of perspective. So here's one way to think about, just had to adjust the screen a little bit. One way to think about personality is these 5 continuums, rating from extroversion to introversion, and then down to openness to experience. So the content in here isn't what's so important. What I'm getting at is just this is just one way to talk about the differences in personality that that someone may have, right? They may be more extroverted or introverted, or agreeable, disagreeable, that type of breakdown. One of the most common ways that we classify personalities, and again, this is difficult to do, due to the dynamic nature of people, right? We change, we experience things differently all the time, which has an impact on who we are and how we respond to the world. But the Myers-Briggs personality type is, it's pretty well known. It's popular. Even here at Clark College, you can go take the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, I believe, at the career services. And it'll give you some insights about your personality, maybe some strengths, some weaknesses. Uh, it helps explain why group members think and react in different ways, examines how people use their minds to perceive the world, and it breaks preferences of thought into 4 different categories. Again, going back to a model that's similar to our Big Five. Okay, let's take a look. So here's the dichotomies. When we're talking dichotomies, we could say these are the continuums. When you take the Myers-Briggs test, you'll answer, 100 or more questions, depending on where you take it. And it will give you your personality in these different letters. So if you tend to score more towards the extroverted side, your output's going to have an E. If you more of an intuition type of person, you'll have an N. So you'll come up with this 4-letter code at the end of taking the exam, your output. Okay, so I'm not recommending that people go take this. There's pros and cons to knowing this. I don't really think it hurts if you understand that personality is dynamic, that people change throughout their lives. So what your score now may be completely different, in 10 years. Pros and cons. When I was a graduate student, a friend of mine was learning how to administer an IQ exam, and she said, I need to practice on 10 people. Will you take the exam? And I said, no. She said, why not? And I said, well, she said, why not? It's free. You'd normally have to pay for it. I said, well, I don't really want to know, because I'm either doing way better in life than I should, or I am way behind where I should be. So I don't want to know. And Myers-Briggs, you look at it the same way. But anyways, so let's look at the output, and let's get to the point and talk about how this pertains to small group communication. Okay. So the first category is extrovert, introvert. You'll either score an E or an I. One of the problems with the model is, let's say here is the midpoint right here. And let's say you score right there, right at that moment. Even though you're right on the borderline, you're still basically labeled an I. So that is one of the problems with this, is it doesn't give you the, a score. You just get this or that. You don't get like a 5 or 4.2, that type of thing. Okay. But anyways, so introvert, extrovert is one dimension. And, we often think of extroverts as being really talkative, introverts as being more quiet. That is kind of an outcome, but that's not the actual definition of introvert, extrovert. An extrovert is someone who gets their energy from being around people. An introvert is someone who gets their energy from, being alone. So you can have talkative introverts and quiet extroverts. Okay. So now there's some things that matter to us here in terms of how we function as a group. So if we look here, introverts prefer one-to-one interactions, where extroverts enjoy group discussions. So how do we typically structure a group? We typically structure it as a group of people doing, talk out loud type of interactions, which is good for the extroverts, but it's not a strength for the introverts, right? Or some introverts. So in this model where we're having these talk out loud group discussions, extroverts are very comfortable talking, then thinking out loud, where introverts, they want a little time to think things over, right? They want to ponder their ideas before they release them to the world. And both of these are great, right? I am not judging one or the other. But if we are going to structure our group in a way that works for both introverts and extroverts, and let's just say these are, the population's half introvert, half extrovert, roughly, we are failing half of our group by only focusing on these out loud group discussions. Okay, we'll talk about that more in a second. Let's go on to the next category, the sensor and intuitive. So the big difference here is the sensors are very focused on the details, very detail-oriented, right? Where intuitives tend to be big picture-oriented, right? They're coming up with the ideas, and then not thinking about all the small little details that go into it. Where our sensors, they're really looking at each detail one at a time and maybe sometimes losing track of the bigger picture, right? One of the things we often do in a group is brainstorm. And if you think about brainstorming, what do? We have someone standing up at a whiteboard or a big piece of paper or something, and they are writing ideas as the rest of the group, who are represented by these circles, are shouting their ideas, right? They're shouting their ideas out loud in a non-judgmental environment. And it's rapid fire. We want to get as many ideas as we can. This person over here is writing them down, right? One after the other. So oftentimes we're shouting out our ideas in bullet points, okay? Where, if we were talking about, if our goal is to come up with a new flavor for a churro dipping sauce, everybody loves churros, if you combine a churro with some type of sauce, it's like 30 times better, right? So if we're trying to brainstorm different types of churro dipping sauce, we're going to be throwing things out like chocolate, caramel, banana puree, whatever it is. And that's how the sensors would do it. But our intuitives, right? They are thinking in details, and they're not thinking in bullet points. They're thinking in paragraphs, and it's really hard to capture that kind of value and those kind of ideas in a bullet point on a whiteboard, right? So by structuring our brainstorming in the traditional model, again, we're not optimizing our group, our group process for the entire group, right? Okay. Let's move on and look at the next category, which is our judger and perceiver. So our judgers value lots of structure and organization, tight timelines, rigorous timelines, detailed agendas, where perceivers recognize that there's value in, just free-form thinking and not having a plan, letting a plan come together, not being overly prescriptive in how we're going to do things as a group. Sometimes we have some issues related to conflicts in this, in terms of when work gets done. So if we have timelines, a judger might, set project timelines that are, really tight and really precise, and even work ahead and beat the timelines, where our perceivers, they like to do things, on a little bit different schedule. So this is one of those ideas where we need clear norms, and we need to realize that when we have perceivers in the group that maybe we need a little bit more leniency and flexibility in how we establish deadlines. Maybe instead of it being due tomorrow, if we can, we try and work it out towards due in 3 days or however, whatever works for our timeline, right? Okay, next up we have our, it's like there's one missing. One I didn't talk about yet. Oh, our thinker and feeler, there we go. So our thinker and feeler, task-oriented, people-oriented. So we could say that our task-oriented people are ones who want to get to work, where our people-oriented, these are people who, hey, let's get to know each other. Let's build cohesion. Let's have, build these relationships. So we need both in a group to really do our best work. Our task people are going to help us move through our project timeline. Our feeler is going to be the person who says, let's take some time and build cohesion. Let's, go to lunch together. Let's do something together that, will help us build our relationships, right? So in the end of all this, here we have what the breakdown might be. So these are the different breaks down in terms of population of what we have, and you can see that there's 16 groups. 16 types of personalities. And then within these, there's different degrees. Someone may be, score an I, but they're really, right on the borderline. Today they're an I, and then, but, maybe yesterday they would have answered more E, right? So, so again, I'm not recommending the Myers-Briggs, but I do recognize that there are different personality types, and we do need to figure out ways to accommodate them, which we'll talk about in the next lecture.